About 2 years ago, the average person buying a home in California believed that that house was going to appreciate by 20% a year for 10 years. Now, the average price at the time was $500,000, which meant that that person buying that house believed that he was going to earn $100,000 a year for the next 10 years. Actually, not more than that, appreciation, actually $3 million over 10 years, because that's what 20% compounded for 10 years would take a $500,000 house and turn it into a $3 million house. So the average person in California who maybe made $50,000 or $60,000 a year believed that by buying a house, he was going to have an extra $250,000 a year in income just because he owned a house. Why even have a job? You know, people used to buy a house because they can afford it. Now they buy a house because they need the money. And if you need more money, you buy a vacation house. People forget that real estate depreciates, that houses have to be maintained, that they cost money. They forgot that when they were speculating. In fact, the people who were buying real estate made the exact same mistakes as the people who were buying stocks. You know, when people were buying stocks in the 1990s, the reason they lost money was not because stocks are bad investments. If you buy a stock at the right price, it's a good investment. The reason they lost money is because they forgot. They overpaid for stocks. It's overpaying for stocks that makes them a bad investment. How do you know you're overpaying? Well, you look at the dividend yield. If you don't get a good dividend, then you're overpaying for the stock. Well, how do you know if you're overpaying for real estate? You look at the rents. And the rent's not just supposed to cover your expenses. You don't invest to break even. You can get 5% in a government bond, right? If you can't get 7 or 8 or 9% return on a piece of property, then you're overpaying. Well, what's been happening in California and other parts of the country, investors, and they're really speculators, were buying property. Not only was there no investment return, but there was negative cash flow. People would buy a piece of property and pay $1 million for it, where the rents that they could collect were less than the mortgage payments on the property, or the taxes, or the maintenance. Less. Now, why were they doing that? Well, because they figured they would make it up on the appreciation. But they didn't bother to ask themselves, why should an asset that's so overpriced that it produces a negative return, why should that asset appreciate? It just should collapse. But the people who were buying real estate and are still buying real estate were making the exact same mistakes that people made in the stock market. They were not basing their investment decision based on the fundamental value of the asset. They were basing it on the belief that prices would rise, on the belief that there would always be a greater fool willing to accept more losses because there was no such, real estate would always go up. It was a sure thing. Just buy it. It doesn't matter what you pay for it. It doesn't matter what the rent is, because it's always going to appreciate. Well, people are now starting to find out that that's not going to happen. And also, you know, one of the reasons people say, well, prices are just going to level off. That's impossible. Prices can't level off. It's like I can't hold a balloon up in the air, a beach ball up in the air like this, and take my hand away and expect the ball to stay there. Why did they get so high in the first place? Why did they get there? Well, they got there because of the artificially low interest rates that existed. Well, those artificially low interest rates are not there anymore. Rates are still not high, but they're not nearly as low as they were. And without those very low rates, these prices are impossible because people can't get payments that low. They also were there because of the complete abolition of lending standards. Well, that process is starting to reverse itself. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But standards are starting to tighten, and they're going to get a lot tighter. And number 3 was the speculative mentality of the buyer. Now, one of the reasons that people who were buying real estate, let's say someone in California who believed this house was going to appreciate by 20% a year. Let's assume my income is $5,000 a month, but I'm going to buy a house where the mortgage payment is $4,000 a month. Well, no sane person would commit 80% of his income to making a mortgage payment. But wait a minute. If I'm expecting that house to appreciate by 20% a year, my real income isn't the $50,000 I earn as a policeman. It's the $100,000 a year or $200,000 a year I'm going to earn as a homeowner. So they take a look at that money, and they figure that's my real income. So they get one of these no-doc loans, one of these liar's loans that you guys came up with, and they say, my income is $150,000 a year. I qualify for that loan. And of course, they pay a little bit higher interest penalty because they didn't want to document their loan. And of course, anybody who can document their loan would do it. Why would anybody that actually had the income not document it? I mean, if they file a tax return, you know, they're lying, but they don't care. And I mentioned this as a paradox, that even though real estate prices were high, rising real estate prices makes real estate affordable. Because if somebody believes they're going to get paid $100,000 a year for owning a house, right, that offsets the actual cost of the mortgage, of the taxes, of the maintenance. But the minute a more realistic outlook for the future price is in the mind of the buyer, the minute he can't anticipate that windfall, all of a sudden the true cost of home ownership becomes apparent to the buyer. And he's not going to pay these prices. But more importantly than the buyers are the lenders who are not going to lend. And the big part of this problem has been from the lender's perspective. You know, traditionally, the way people bought a house is they went to a bank, and the bank wrote them a mortgage. And the bank held that mortgage for 30 years. And so the bank had a big vested interest in the loan getting repaid. So how did the bank ensure that that loan was repaid? Well, it was very careful about who it lent money to and under what terms money was lent. Buyers needed a 20% down payment. Why did they need a down payment? Well, so they wouldn't cut and run at the first sign of trouble, number one. Number two, because the ability to save a down payment said something about an individual's character and their ability to save and pay for the ongoing expenses of home ownership. And number three, if the home went into foreclosure, the bank had a cushion. Right? There was something there. Also, when the appraiser was hired, it was hired by the bank, and the bank wanted that appraisal to be accurate because that was what it needed if there was a default. It had to know, what is this asset worth? Because I'm going to carry this note on my books for 30 years. If this guy doesn't pay, what can I sell this property for? So there was a lot of scrutiny, and there was a lot of soundness in the lending practices. And of course, the lenders would say, well, I'm not going to lend any more than, 30%. I'm not going to let somebody borrow or commit to a home where the payments are more than 30% of their income, because they know what can reasonably be handled. And of course, they wanted the borrower to fully document that loan. Yes, we want proof. I'm not just going to accept your word for what you make. Prove it. Now, how does the lending industry work today? Well, you've got this huge moral hazard built in, and a lot of it was created by government and the guaranteed mortgages of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But what happens is you've got a whole bunch of people in this room that are lending money. But when you lend the money, does anybody in this room keep that loan? No, it gets sold. It gets repackaged, and these other companies buy them. And then they repackage them again, and they get sold to Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley. That creates these collateralized mortgage obligations, or they sell them to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that just buy them if they're conforming loans. So what happens is the lenders just want to make loans. They don't care if they're ever repaid because they're not going to own the loan. Now all of a sudden, when they hire an appraiser, do they want an appraiser who's going to give an accurate appraisal? No. They want an appraiser who's going to appraise the property high enough to fund this loan. The appraisers know that. The appraisers want to get jobs. They want to get hired. Who hires them? The mortgage lenders. If a guy keeps coming in with low appraisals, he's not going to get any work. So the appraisers have an incentive to inflate the value of the home. Of course, the buyers, they don't care. They just think it's all going to go up. So they just want to close on this thing. In fact, back in California, when I was living there, I mean, the house would go on the market, and there'd be 100 offers, and people would write in with sob stories. Please sell me your house. I mean, I go to church every week. I mean, it was like a gravy train. All you had to do was own this house, and you were home free. Done. You were rich. You didn't have to work anymore. So all they want to do is buy this home.